So I'm so excited to welcome you to the Writer Center's virtual craft chat series, where we talk with writers a little less about what they wrote and a little more about how they wrote it. My name's Emily Holland, and I'm thrilled to have Gabrielle Bates joining us as today's guest in celebration of her poetry collection, Judas Goat. Thank you, Gabrielle, for spending your evening with us. Would you feel comfortable kind of kicking us off with a brief reading just to start?
Yeah, thank you so much for having me, Emily and Amy. The Writer Center is so cool, and I'm so grateful for all the work that you're doing in virtual space, in real life. I hope to have the chance to visit your physical space one day. But I'm just so grateful. I know so much time and energy and heart goes into making things like this happen, especially on a regular basis. So I just want to share my gratitude for that. I'm going to open with just two poems. I'm going to read a poem called The Mentor, which is on page 33 of the book, if you happen to like to follow along and have a copy. And then I'm also going to read a poem called Ownership, which is on page 78. The Mentor. He carved faces into the dead parts of cedars. He wore a belt of chisels around his waist. To determine where they were dead, he took a leafless limb, followed it like thread back to its spool, down the corresponding strip of trunk. In the middle of those woods, where the ground sloped into a large bowl, mist often got trapped, parted at our calves. We walked together for a long time, and as we walked, he traced what I said back to my left breast, down to the tender hole where I was once attached to my mother, until I went silent. Then he braced my back against a tree. He took out a chisel and kneeled. You ask when I stopped shouting everything and started keeping language close to my mouth, as if I were reading to a match that had to last my life. Well, it was not that day. That was much later, after the trees had all been cleared and the earth leveled. When I stopped begging to be believed and started telling the truth, no man was there. And then the second poem, Ownership, in memory of Jay. Yes, I have trouble dwelling in what's mine. No, I did not suspect his pain. My mind is the one that's still here, that received the news, then saw the bone, its row of flat herbivore's teeth, absorbing green from the moss. Bent close, I described it until it was strange, then familiar, then stranger. A character transplaced from Ovid, saved or punished, storied dear but concocted around the hymn of him I'd known, if shallowly. A boy. I'd touched his shoulders. I'd watched him dance in the fat intersection of college and magnolia, red lights glossing his open mouth and limbs. His being now, a chrysalis of flesh and hide amassing, then dissolving away as the wind picks up, rhythmic but ruptured on the bluff, a statue that could never be of stone. His bed was elevated on crates and concrete blocks. that I have always loved a storm that can't touch me is no secret. What if I touched it? All of it. Description drifting all over the dashboard, a running boy's essence poured into a deer's mouth, displacing the deer's essence, running on and stumbling uphill, heaven haunted toward the sound.
Thank you. Thank you for reading those poems. I'm so glad you read Ownership, because I have some questions maybe around that poem. But if that doesn't make you want to buy the book, I don't know what will. So thank you. And just another reminder to please, please, please purchase a copy wherever you can, or request it from your library. But
yeah. And we are coming up on Indie Bookstore Day. I'd be remiss if we didn't shout out this Saturday, all over the country, wherever you live. It's Independent Bookstore Day. So there's never a bad time to support your local indie bookstore, but this weekend is an even better time.
Yes, no, that's a great reminder. I have a scavenger hunt ready for our local indie bookstores here. So ready to spend the day out and about filling my shelves. But all right, Gabrielle, could you tell us a little bit about who you are, maybe how you came to poetry?
Yeah. So I grew up in Birmingham, Alabama, in the Alabama public school system. I know that we must have interacted with poetry here and there, but I was not aware that contemporary poetry, like poetry being written by people who are alive right now, I didn't know that that world existed until I was in college. So I was studying English just sort of broadly at Auburn University in Alabama. And I took, as part of the creative writing general curriculum, a poetry class, and we were assigned several contemporary poetry collections, one of which was Richard Siken's Crush. And it was like every closed door in my brain just swung open, and I just felt myself come alive in this way I never had before. And it's interesting how much the word permission has started coming into vogue around people talking about writing, but Richard Siken and that book really felt like it gave me permission to be the kind of writer I yearned to be, which was free to be wild and strange and perhaps even violent. I don't know, there was a freedom to reading that work that made me fall in love with poetry. There are all these ways that, looking back, I can see how I was searching for poetry without knowing it. I was a voracious reader of novels, and I would zero in on particular sentences and images and even sounds within novels. I would also spend hours just reading song lyrics online. So looking back, I just see all these ways that I was a poet, but I thought I wanted to be, a novelist, or a creative nonfiction seemed to me a more serious and respectable thing to be for a while when I was resisting poetry. So that's sort of my journey. Once I fell in love with those contemporary poetry books, my whole life was sort of beautifully derailed from that point onward. My life has just become more and more poetry centered and obsessed ever since. I kind of immediately went from undergrad to studying poetry, specifically in an MFA program. And then I started working for Open Books, a Poem Emporium, which is one of the only bookstores dedicated to poetry in the world. I started co-hosting a poetry podcast with some dear poet friends. So it's really lucky all the ways that I get to be involved in poetry.
Yeah, no, that's wonderful. And I remember Crush being one of those books too, that as a young undergraduate student, I latched onto, and it was in my backpack every day. I was rereading it. I was reading it aloud. We had study groups to like pick it apart, right? And I think finding
Yes.
some sort of entry point into the world of contemporary poetry is just
You get it.
an
I'm
opening.
so glad. I'm so glad you get it. Yeah, I mean, right? It was like funny and sexy and dark and surprising. And I mean, he's utilizing a lot of tricks from cinematography. So it's just like a very vivid visual experience, which speaks to me. But yeah, it's really fun to see. I think, writers, particularly of our generation, that was such a touchstone for so many of us.
Yeah. So our typical opening question normally is what we call our hardest question. And it's around, something you haven't been asked before. But I was reading some of your other interviews and someone asked that question to you. So I was like, okay, let me push myself and think of a better question. So I hope this one is somewhat interesting to get us started. But I think that the poems we're drawn to as readers and writers, they kind of tell us about ourselves and our writing, even if they're different from what we do on the page. So with that in mind, if you could have written any poem by another poet, what poem would it be and why?
Oh, wow. What a fantastic question. The kind of poem envy. I love that this is tapping into. Oh my gosh, there have been so many poems that I've encountered throughout my life where, it's like that you just want to like throw the book across the room feeling. You're like, like this is so amazing. How did they do it? Like, if I could do that, then, my life would be complete. Those sorts of feelings. Sharon Olds has done that to me multiple times. Honestly, her entire book, Stag's Leap. I'm not going to say I wish I'd written it because it's so tied up in like a very particular painful divorce experience. So I don't wish that on myself in order to be able to write that book. But oh wow, just the book itself is incredible. I felt that way about Bridget Pegeen Kelly's poem Song, which is a favorite of so many people's. But honestly, I think the truest answer to this question is going to be Ross Gay's Catalog of Unabashed Gratitude. I think that is a poem that is so outside of my own, I feel like, abilities and even disposition on the page. But particularly when I hear Ross Gay read this poem, which all of you can do just by going to YouTube, there's an amazing rendition of Ross Gay reading this poem. And I believe the music that is put to it is by Bon Iver. So famous musician, incredible poet mashup. But I can turn on that recording and just feel so alive and awake to the world and its multivariant sorrows and joys and textures. And there's so much just delight in the language itself and the journey that Ross Gay takes us on in that poem. It's virtuosic, it's astounding, it's cathartic. Like I reach the end of this kind of epic poem and sometimes I weep. Like I'm in awe of that poem. And it's a poem about gratitude. And I'm just so grateful that Ross Gay is alive, that he is writing poems like this. Oh my God, if I could write that kind of poem, I feel like I would have reached like I would have unlocked like a new spiritual level or something.
No, that's a great answer. So thank you for indulging the
I
opening
love the question. And just as an interviewer, I so appreciate and respect that you just like really prepared for this and took note of the fact that I'd already answered that question and changed it. It means so much as someone who's like done a fair number of interviews at this point. Like, sometimes you can tell people didn't even engage with your work at all, and it's so sad. But
no, that's
it's already like one of the best interviews I've ever done.
Well, you're making my birthday the best, so we're having a good exchange here. And it looks like Emma has maybe put that YouTube link in the chat so we can all save it and watch it later. Wonderful. So let's dive into some of the poems in your collection, because I don't know. I feel like maybe I can call myself like an OG fan. Like if I was in my actual house, I would be pointing at the Strawberries broadside that I have from Bull City Press. So engaging with the full collection was just such an experience for me, that I'm very grateful for. And so I love to just like dive in. And I think maybe an entry point would be talking through some of the images and themes that kind of recur. Of course, we get, animals, the goat, but there's also different animals, sheep, and some other things coming in. The interplay between humans and animals and this sense of wildness, right? Place, sharpness, knives in different ways. And there's so many more. So how do you embrace those sorts of recurrences or repetitions in your work?
There's so many mysterious aspects to the creative process, and one of them is how I really feel like our obsessions choose us. Like we can try to run from them, and we do on occasion, but for me, I find that once these obsessions start to emerge, if I try to run away from them, my work ends up feeling flat, un uninteresting to me. I end up feeling kind of like a hack, like a poser. I really think, we have to write what we have to write. And even before we know why certain things are recurring, getting more and more curious about why they might be occurring, and even starting to write into them on purpose, these things that have recurred just on accident. There was a point, and I don't know exactly when it was, where I just started getting really interested in that. And I started getting more and more interested in just like the role of the unconscious in general too. I feel like there's this way that we give ourselves these little clues and these little gifts, that then end up being what stitches a book together. And many times, like if I didn't have recurrences and obsessions, then I'm not quite sure what would make this feel like more than just a random collection of poems. I want, as a reader and a writer, for a collection to build in some way, even if it's not in an exact linear order. I want one poem to inform or evolve in some way into a later one. I love when images recur across different poems and accrue different meanings and layers. We see them in different contexts, maybe with different tones attached to them. So if anything, I've just become more and more over time about leaning into the obsessions. I think they're like gifts from ourselves to ourselves. And it can be easy, we were just talking about, like envy for other poets. And I think particularly when I was much younger, I had a lot of envy, and I really discounted my own, natural gifts, whatever they may have been, because I was always interested in trying to push in other directions and develop skills I didn't have. But I don't know, maybe it's corny, but at the end of the day, like, aren't we all just trying to contribute what only we can contribute? And why waste our time trying to write into things that don't feel like our genuine questions or the material that life has given us, either through our imagination or through our lived experience? Like that's our material. That's what we have to offer. And so, yeah, I think we do ourselves and others a disservice if we run away from that.
Yeah, I think that's such a good point about, like, maybe as a younger poet wanting to do things that you're seeing happening in other people's poems. I definitely remember that urge, but then never being satisfied with the poem. Like, why isn't this working? And it's like, well, because that's not me, right? That's not what I need to be writing. And I think it's difficult to get to that point where you're like, oh, okay, like I need to actually write what I need to be writing and not what I think so and so style is that's going to, I don't know, get me published or something.
Yes, it's such a trap. It can be such a trap trying to like write what you think will, get
Mhm.
you published or impress this particular teacher. Um, it's funny. I think there's like two kinds of personalities that really have to work with this. And, like me, I'm naturally by inclination kind of a people pleaser, star student energy, like I want to please the person in charge. I want to like get the A. But I think people who are very rebellious by nature run into this problem too, but sort of in the opposite way. Like they're trying so hard to do what's, not in style or something, that then sometimes they don't let themselves write what they really need to write. Because what
Mm.
if they actually need to be writing like a fairly plain spoken narrative poem, and they're resisting that because they feel like they need to be doing these wild experimentations with fragmented language or something. So much of writing and art making is just about honing that intuition and learning. It's harder than one might think to really like check in with that inner compass and
Mm.
like what direction am I being called in? Where is my genuine curiosity being drawn, and how can I chase that?
Mm. Yeah, yeah. And talking about the recurrences, you mentioned the fact that that's sort of maybe the impulse to put things together for a book. So I wondered if you could talk a little bit about when you started seeing the collection take shape and how that process evolved for you over time.
Mhm. I'm just going to be real. I struggled so hard putting this collection together. I worked on it for about 10 years in all, and the book felt very close to done for a lot of that time. So I was in this like extremely frustrated place of feeling like I was like 80 to 90% done with the book, but I just could not figure out what the right order was. And it felt like maybe a couple of pieces were missing, but I couldn't figure out what they were.
Mm.
And so it was just so much continuing to write, trial and error. I would pull poems out, I would add new poems in, I would sort of reevaluate, lots of printing out all the pieces and putting them around on the floor and up on the wall. So much sharing the manuscript with trusted friends who are also poets, doing like manuscript exchanges. For years, I was doing that. For so many years, I was doing that. And I just knew in my heart, speaking back to intuition, I wanted it to be done, but it was not done. I knew in my knower that it hadn't locked into place yet. And it was, it was so frustrating. It was honestly devastating, but I'm just so happy it finally got there. And there were several things that helped me finally get there. One is I think it just took the time it took for me to keep writing pieces, to get the right ones to even work with. But I got feedback from a trusted reader that it felt like there was something unplumbed about the speaker's relationship to the mother. She was like, there's like some things like kind of hinted at here and there. There's like this kind of haunting absence of this mother figure, but it feels like you're holding a lot back there that, the reader could get something out of. So I actually had the opportunity to go on basically the only writing residency of my life. I had a week at this place called Friday Harbor, here near, not far from Seattle on San Juan Island. And I was going with one friend, and I just decided I was going to write an essay about like relationship to mothers, like literary mothers, as well as biological mother, stepmothers. I was just going to really write it all out, just leave it all on the page. And eventually that essay was edited and revised way down into what is now the long poem called Mothers that comes near the end of the book. And once I had that sort of final piece, it really felt like, I don't know if I can use like a sports metaphor here, but it was like leaving it all on the court, like I exhausted myself writing that piece, and then spent tons of time revising it. And once that sort of final piece was there, I was able to get the order, and it really felt like I could close the container of the book at that point. I then ended up going through a few more rounds with my editor at Tin House, and we did some kind of nitpicky things. But overall, I feel like writing that long poem was what finally allowed me to finish this project. I was beginning to think it might never happen.
Do you think part of what helped was to like switch out of maybe a poetry mode, like move into that essay space to sort of open up the page? Like, was that helpful? Or
Yeah, I think that may have helped. Just like, sometimes switching up your format is re-energizing, gives you new eyes. I think also, maybe working in prose allowed me to think differently and kind of process what I had and then what I hadn't gone into yet. It did feel like a stepping stone from just writing individual poem after individual poem and trying to make each one as vivid and wild and sharp as I possibly could make it. And then it was more of like a critical lens, I guess. Thinking in a different way about my obsessions. And
no, that's great. And I think too, it's really great to hear that sort of honesty about like, one, it can take a long time, right? It's not just going to happen. Just because you have enough poems for a collection doesn't mean that that's the collection. So it's great to have that sort of honesty on the table too.
Yeah, and everyone's different, like some people may have been content or just really ready to move on and focus on something very different. And so maybe they would have just, put the poems together and be like, this is what it is. It's good enough for me, and that's fine. But that's not what I wanted from my first book. I was, as painful as it was, the wait, I wanted to wait until I felt like I was really putting the strongest, most resonant book out there that I possibly could at this time. Like I will continue to grow and learn as a poet. And there may be a time when I look back on this book and think, oh gosh, like I wish I could change so many things about it. But I really feel like I saved myself to an extent from that feeling by taking so much time with it and really refining over so much time, and also preemptively deciding to have grace for my past self. I've been exercising that with individual poems for a decade or more already. I don't know, it always makes me sad when poets disavow their earlier books, especially when they're books that mean something to me. I mentioned Bridget Pegeen Kelly earlier. She comes up in the book here and there by name. And, she apparently really just despised her first book so much that she requested that Yale, the press, don't reprint it, like let it just die out of circulation. So it can be kind of hard to find. And there's so many poets who have done that, but I hope to not be one of those.
Yeah, I'm gonna pop into the chat because there's some questions still about maybe like the construction of the book before we move on to some other things. So Angela's wondering kind of around like, how do you decide on those poems that are maybe sort of like walking the line of like they belong, maybe they don't belong? How do you make those decisions of like what to include and what maybe is a good poem but maybe not fitting for the collection?
Yeah, it's really intuition and feedback from people I trust that helps me make those decisions. There were a lot of poems that I've published in journals, a few that have been anthologized multiple times, and several that really in some ways fit in the world of this collection. You know, they have a similar mood or are engaged with similar questions, but they just ultimately didn't feel like they had a place in this book. Either there just wasn't the right placement for them, and like they caused an unpleasant ripple in the momentum of the book, or they were trying to do something too similar in terms of their questions and their tone to other poems that felt like they belonged even more. So in general, I try to approach poetry with as much humility as I can and really be in service to the best book, the best poem possible, whatever my metric for that may be. And so it really felt easy for me to cut things when I sensed that I didn't need them. That was in general my approach to revising poems as well. If I could cut something without losing something that felt essential to the poem and what it was trying to do, then I cut it, and I felt good about that. And so, yeah, and I always tell myself that, you know, maybe it'll belong in what comes next. You know, if a poem has life, it has life. And I really don't feel like there's a timestamp on a truly alive piece of art. And so, yeah, if any of those things that didn't make it into Judas Goat feel like they belong in my next collection, then I'll put them in there, but who knows?
Yeah, the B-sides get their
Yeah.
time to shine, right?
Exactly. And that's part of what's fun about, you know, having poems that exist out there in journals and poems that exist in my book. You know, so many of the poems are in a very different form. Hardly any of the poems are exactly the same in the book as they were in a journal. Because I've really approached publishing in journals as part of my revision process, like printing out a poem versus just working with it on a screen, or like switching the genre from poetry to prose. There's something about seeing a poem for me in a journal that often helps me make some final edits, or I can see some lines that I don't need. I can see some line breaks I wish were different. And so I love that poems can have multiple lives that way. You know, however, I may have read those poems out loud at readings before they were published. That's another way that they get to live. Yeah, it's all exciting.
Yeah, I love that. Maybe we'll move on to some questions about sort of that revision step, or that kind of, I know we mentioned the word permission before, but I think a lot of times we think like once something is published, it's like permanent and like, okay, it's done, right? But I think seeing poems like Strawberries, which the broadside is a little bit different, it's very subtle differences, but I was like holding up the book to to look. But also I use mixed press in some of my revision classes when I'm talking with students, and so we watched your construction of ownership on that one, which was really interesting, but also still some subtle differences, right, in that version versus the printed version in the book. So can you talk a little bit about how you approach revision generally, and then how you kind of lean into, I guess, the opening of possibility when you are publishing, and then kind of thinking through a collection as well?
Yeah. So for those in the Zoom room who don't know, Midst is this fascinating journal, website, app, where you can watch a time lapse of someone writing a poem. So people write in this particular program, and it creates basically like a movie of all the choices you're making, all the changes you're making. It feels a little bit like being naked in front of everyone. I found it very vulnerable, but rewarding as something to play with. And just, yeah, getting insight into other people's processes was also fascinating. I love watching those time lapses. Although sometimes I feel like, are people cheating? Because like these first drafts are really good, and then you're not changing them very much. But like, I know I'm a relentless reviser, but come on, like.
Yeah, I always have that question when I'm looking at them, which is, it's neither here nor there. But I think what I really appreciated and why we sort of honed in on your poem there was because it started out in like that single stanza structure, and we could see you kind of popping in maybe possible titles and maybe playing with different images and things. And then it became really organized in these couplets. And so yeah, I'm just curious about kind of that decision making on the level of the draft.
Yeah, and I mean, I haven't rewatched this in a long time, but I assume that you can also see me like when I realize I want to make a change, I'll usually copy the entire draft I have and then paste it at the top of the document and then make the changes. So there's sort of like this running long tail of previous versions right beneath what I'm working on. And I hardly ever actually go back to those, but it's very comforting for me to know that they're there. Nothing is lost that way. But yeah, I mean, for me, I love stanzas. Like, I'm such a poetry nerd. I love stanzas, and I love trying to listen to a draft and look at a draft and try to think about what stanza structure it feels like it wants to be. And very often it will appear to me that the thoughts are coming out in particular units, whether it's tercets or couplets. And I mean, anytime there's a poem where there's a really central, couple at the heart of the poem, couplets often feel like a sort of a natural thing to at least try out, at least see if that's what it wants. Tercets are a happy place for me. They feel very sturdy. My thoughts often sort of come out in tercets naturally, I've noticed. But yeah, it's really just about like looking and listening, although I do know my natural inclination is towards a stanza of some regular length. So it's rare for me to have sort of like 4 lines followed by 2, followed by 3. I'm usually gonna lean towards having couplets all the way through, or tercets all the way through, or one long stanza. Did I answer your
Yeah, no, I think that's really useful, because I think, sometimes we know those habits about ourselves, but then we are like, well, I don't want to do that anymore, right? Like almost every draft I write comes out in couplets, and I'm like, why am I doing this again? But sometimes it needs to, it needs to be in couplets. And I
and as
read
long as you're
yeah.
asking the question, as long as you're like, okay, does this really need to be in couplets, or is that just how I needed to get it out in the first place?
Mm-hmm.
What is the argument for this poem being in couplets? And if you can't come up with an answer that's at least like interesting to you, like maybe it's worth trying something else. But
Yeah. In the interview you did with Adroit, you mentioned like being drawn to that idea of like neatness on the page, which I see definitely in couplets and kind of like the structured stanzas. But I'm wondering how you then sort of like lean into maybe disorder in some way, or playfulness, maybe within the imagery or like the texture of the language itself within the poems.
it was so important to me in writing this book that I allow myself to be disobedient and disturbing and wild and sexy and even mean sometimes, all these things that I didn't feel like I could be in my lived life, growing up, socialized as a girl in a very conservative Southern environment. And so I think it was really in just like the characters and the speakers and yeah, and in some ways the images themselves. That was sort of where the wildness and stuff came in. I don't feel like there are chaotic elements to this book. There's play, and there's, I hope, what comes through is a real love and delight in language, even if the poems themselves aren't like delightful. But I think this book is so interested in interrogating these different forms of control and ways that people and other animals are trained and taught and corralled, that like neat structures felt right, and I wanted the subversions of that neatness and that control to be sort of subtle but very palpable.
Mhm.
You know, the hope was that, you know, the book itself would sort of feel like the Judas Goat was sort of like leading you through these sort of like harrowing situations, and you want to keep going, but you're also like a little afraid. You like
Mm.
never quite know what's about to happen because there's this kind of atmosphere of threat around. And so, yeah, but who knows, maybe my next book will invite in a little more chaos energy. We'll see.
Well, since you mentioned the Judas Goat figure, I was hoping we could talk a little bit about the title poem. One, because I mean, it's a beautiful poem. It gives us so much about the collection that we've kind of been building towards, right? It comes at that kind of end of the third section, and there's, you know, visual movement, there's sort of the interplay of all these different themes. But what I really love about it is like the opening where we start with that we, and then we sort of distill down to the I of the speaker, and the ending just really is so poignant and powerful. And so hopefully we'll talk about endings after this, but could you just talk about like what your goal was for this poem, and like when did you decide that this poem would share the title of the collection?
Yeah, I mean, my aspiration with most poems, I think, is to offer like as clear of an experience as possible in terms of like what's happening on the page, while also incorporating as many multiple meanings as possible, so that like the more times you return to a poem or even individual lines, sort of like the more different ways you could read it. And I think about that with this poem. I mean, that opening, if I'm going to get it correctly, like we of our ends are perhaps all this oblivious, and that we, and even the word ends there, you know, like our ends, that could be like our deaths, that could be the ends like to which we are put, like what we are used for, our ends. And so I think, I mean, the main thing I was trying to do in that poem is just write into this phenomenon that intrigued and disturbed me so thoroughly when I learned about it. You know, this goat that's trained to live with the sheep that leads them into the slaughterhouse, and just like what that raised for me around ignorance and complicity, and you know, the blurred lines between humans and animals, and naming, you know, like this goat didn't name itself the Judas Goat, you know, humans did that, and what does that mean? And ultimately, that ending, you know, I am too dying of what I don't know, this idea of ignorance as a kind of death, particularly, you know, kind of violent ignorance. And yeah, I mean, I never know. Well, that's a lie. I was going to say I never know what the ending of a poem is going to be when I start out to write it, but there have been times when the ending was all I knew about a poem before I started writing it. I mean, you mentioned ending, so I'll go there.
Yeah.
There was a time when endings were by far my favorite part of poems, like other people's, my own. I would occasionally even skip to the end, like read the end of a poem first to decide if I wanted to read the poem. I don't know what that was about. But maybe I was just ravenous for epiphany. Maybe I was just aware that many poets tended to put their best lines at the very end of a poem. I don't know what it was, but I think, you know, I've had time to reflect on it now, and I think it has something to do with the silence at the end of a poem, the longer reverberation time that you get in collaboration with the reader's mind at the end of a poem. You know, the ending line or sentence of a poem is like this baby you're thrusting into the reader's arms, and like they have to hold it for a little bit, you know, like you can't just skip on to the next the way you do with the rest of the poem. Like there's a different kind of echo, right? Like I'm not the only one that feels this. The very end of a poem, it sticks with you longer. And I think with the right lines, that just increases its power and its meaning. You know, that's so much of poetry's power in general, right? Is just the more time we spend with it, the more it rewards us. A great poem you can read again and again and again, and it's still going to mean something to you and going to mean differently often. And so, yeah, I think my affinity for the endings of poems has something to do with that.
Yeah, I think that sort of like sense of echo is something that I felt like it's great to have the collection, right? Because that act of like turning the page is sort of like giving you that time to like sit and breathe and move a little bit. And even, you know, thinking back to Judas Goat, sort of that like extended space that we get because we're like breaking on the section. So we're really sitting with it and really thinking about the implication of those last lines. And yeah, I mean, so many of the endings here, I was like, wait, let me just pause, you know, we're going to soak that in. And yeah, Allison mentioning that line break too, which I think is amazing. That sort of pivot point, right? That sort of opens up like maybe the possibility of a question, but then we move into it. So yeah, I think endings are so powerful. And the space that we have here in the book to kind of sit with them and feel the reverberations is really lovely.
That means so much coming from you and coming from Allison, whose poems just freaking blow me away. Everyone needs to check out Allison Adair's work if they haven't already. This talk about like endings and the extra space of the section break is reminding me of a question in the chat from Mick Powell asking about the placement of the dog, or pointing that out, the very opening poem of the book, which is set off by itself, like in its own section, like a preface, which I'm by no means the first poet to do that. Many books are having this sort of move at the beginning. But for a while, it was difficult for me to know where to put that poem in particular. I was a little scared to put it first because it's a bit intense and traumatic in its subject matter. But ultimately, it just became clear that it couldn't go anywhere else. It did not feel like the right place to end the book. It felt like far too severe a note to end on. It didn't feel true to the arc as a whole. And so it became clear that it needed to go first, and it establishes so many central tensions and questions and themes and fears. I was a big believer throughout my 20s and working on this book that I needed to write into what scared me. And I have a quote by my desk from the poet Audre Lorde that says, "I am listening to what fear teaches." And that was really a guiding principle for me in this book. And I think the dog highlights, some fears around attachment and commitment and interdependence in some ways that the book goes on to unpack. And in the book, I don't know, I can go on and on, but there's a image in that opening poem of, the collar and the leash, which is this site of risk and ultimately loss. And then the book ends on this poem called Anniversary, where there's a very different kind of imperfect circle image in this wedding band that overlaps like an overbite, which is still a site of a certain kind of risk, but by the end of the book, it's a rewarding risk. There is tenderness there. There is the decision to choose love and commitment despite those risks. And so I like to think that whether people notice it or not, that one imperfect circle image sort of harkens back to the other and ultimately makes the structure of the book feel a little bit like an imperfect circle. So yeah, that's the dog a little bit why that's first.
No, that's wonderful. And I think too, it's really important to think about how that opening poem functions in the collection, similarly to how like this idea of the title poem functions, the end poem, right? There's sort of these like landmarks within the collection that you don't always realize when you're reading someone else's book, but then when you put your own together, it's like, oh wait, like I do need to really be doing something meaningful at these moments.
Yeah. And also it's funny how often I hear myself saying, I resisted doing this for a long time. And then I ultimately, stopped running from it. That happened with putting the dog first. That happened with titling the book, Judas Goat. I really resisted having a title poem for a long time because that does put so much pressure on that one poem sometimes. And in other books, if there's a title poem, it's often either by far the longest poem in the book, or it's the name of a series that sort of stitches the book together all the way through. And mine is neither of those things. It's a very short poem. It comes, kind of sturdily sort of in the middle of the book. But ultimately, I had a friend who's also an amazing editor and also an incredible poet named Carrie Wason. If anyone is looking to hire an editor for their poetry book, I do recommend her. She was the one who we were talking on the phone after she'd read my manuscript, and she was like, okay, why are you not titling the book Judas Goat? And like, she just wanted me to like make an argument against it, and I couldn't. I was like, you're right, it's the best title for the book. I was resisting it for these reasons. And I'm so glad that I did. It feels so clearly like the right title for this book.
Yeah. And you mentioned earlier resisting until finally giving in. So it seems like the title was one of those moments too, where it's like, oh yeah, that's where it needs to be going. So we're sort of winding down to our time, which I'm very sad about, but I wanted to talk a little bit about, or give you an opportunity to talk about how sort of the writing community impacts your work, because you are the host of the Poet Salon, one of the hosts of the Poet Salon, which puts you in communication with so many different writers, your work with Open Books, and of course, just being sort of a vibrant literary person online and in other spaces. So how do those conversations influence your writing, or how does the writing community influence your process?
I love this question. It's funny, I on occasion have people, writers who move to Seattle reach out to me, just be like, hey, can we like get a coffee? Because I'm like new to the area and I don't know anybody. And I had one of those coffees yesterday, and the person asked me like, is writing lonely? Is that lonely for you? And I could tell that like the answer was supposed to be yes, or like that's what it was for him. And so he was like looking for some camaraderie around that. And I just had to be honest. I was like, no, never. Like writing is not lonely endeavor for me at all. And maybe it was at one point, but first, I mean, I love people, but I'm a highly introverted person. I do not need a lot of social interaction in order to feel like fulfilled. And I love my solitude. I'm very happy in solitude. So that might just be one thing, is just like by personality, I don't get lonely very easily. But also, I mean, maybe every city is like this, but Seattle in particular feels just so abundant with incredible writers and poets who are also really wonderful and kind human beings. And just by living here for 9 years and working lots of readings and hanging out at open books, a Poem Emporium, and taking the occasional class through Hugo House, which might be sort of like the Writer Center here in Seattle. They have classes and workshops and things like that. Just by being active and literary spaces, I just met people over time and they're dear friends. I feel like if I, write a draft that I'm excited about, I have some people I could email that draft to and get feedback from. And the podcast is an amazing excuse to reach out to writers whose work I adore and get to be in conversation with them about it. Like, it blows my mind that people say yes to that. Like, especially in the beginning, because we were just making it up. We have no institutional support. We had no business reaching out to people like Ada Limon and Danez Smith and like these, for poets, like very famous poets, and being like, hey, you want to talk to us about poetry? But yeah, that in particular, the podcast has been on a bit of a hiatus, but I'm trying to get it back soon, get it back on track, because I miss it so much. It really fed me on a soul level, because there are times inevitably when our own work is going to be disappointing to us. Things aren't going to be working. We're going to be frustrated, whatever it is. But in those moments, what sustains me are these conversations with other poets. It's getting excited about other people's books. That's my antidote. That's my anchor. It's a really like defining myself to myself as a lover of this art, more so than defining myself to myself as a practitioner of it or like a writer myself. I think that's been like a key to a sustainable practice. And, the more I'm reading poetry books that are exciting to me, the more I'm getting ideas for my own work. And it's like a very synergistic way of approaching it, I think.
Yeah. Well, I think that is a beautiful way to end our conversation. I hate that the hour has just flown by, but I feel like we could talk for forever. But thank you so much, Gabrielle, for sharing not only your time, but your honesty, your wisdom, and your words in Judas Goat. Again, please pick up a copy of the book. The link is in the chat. Go to your independent bookstores on Saturday. It's going to be a fun time everywhere. But thank you so much, Gabrielle. It's been such a joy to chat with you today.
Yeah, thank you so much, everyone, for being here. It was wonderful to see names and faces, who I know and who I don't know. And happy birthday again, Emily. I hope you're about to go eat some delicious cake or pie or whatever your treat of choice is.
Yes, thank you. Thank you so much. Thank you for making my birthday full of poetry, which is how I want it to be. So thank you all for spending time with us this evening. Hope you have a wonderful rest of your Thursday, wherever you are. And thank you again, Gabrielle. It's been a joy.
Good night. Love y'all.